Hey everybody, this is Craig with Mutant Audio, bringing you part 2 in our basic synthesis tutorial. In this part of the tutorial we're going to cover a few different sections of the synthesizer. We're going to cover the filter, the LFOs, and the modulation envelopes. If you haven't already viewed the first part of the tutorial, go ahead and do that now. The first part of the tutorial we talk about the oscillator and the amp envelopes, and in that part of the tutorial I explain how an envelope works, and I'm not going to cover that ground again here. I'm going to explain how the filter envelope applies to the filter, but I'm not going to go over the attack, decay, sustain, and release portion of it here. So check that part of the tutorial out if you haven't already. If not, let's go ahead and get started here. First section we're going to talk about is the filter. And what a filter does is it applies sort of an equalization to the sound that the synth is producing. And there are different types of filters that we can apply here. Every synth is going to have a number of different types of filters. The most common that you're going to see are going to be the low-pass filter, the band-pass filter, and the high-pass filter. And what these are going to essentially do is cut out part of the frequency spectrum of the sound that the synth is generating. So in this case we have here set up a low-pass filter right now. And when I play the synth you hear kind of a mid-tone, and what's happening is that it's only letting the lower frequencies pass through, and the frequency that it's cutting off at is controlled by this frequency slider knob here. So if I move the knob down a bit, you hear that we're cutting out only but the very low frequencies, and if I change the octave here on my keyboard you can hear that a little bit more effectively. And if I move it up near the top, you're going to hear that now a lot more of the lower frequencies are getting through because we're not as severely cutting them off. We've basically raised what's called the cutoff frequency of the synth. So you can hear that a lot more of the high frequency sounds are making it through with the frequency slider raised up there. Now the resonance filter, what it's going to do, or the resonance parameter, what it's going to do is it's going to apply, when you're using a low pass or a high pass filter, it's going to apply a bit of emphasis around that cutoff frequency. So you can hear that there's a marked difference there. It's applying some of that emphasis around it. And if I drop it down here towards the middle again, you'll hear a slightly different sound. And if I drop it way down, you hear it even changes more. And that's of course playing a lower note there on my keyboard. Now the high pass frequency works very similar to the low pass frequency. Instead of cutting out the high frequencies and letting the low frequencies pass through, it cuts out the low frequencies and lets the high frequencies pass through. So you hear we have a very different sound. That's that low note that I was playing before. Now if I raise up different octave on my keyboard, you can hear it's cutting out all that low frequency information that was coming through before. And again, the slider works similarly. Now we're only letting very high frequencies through. And if I drop it down, we're going to let more of the low frequencies through. And it works the same with the resonance parameter. It's going to emphasize the sound around that cutoff frequency. Now bandpass filter is going to pass a band of frequencies, just like the name implies, and what it's doing is it's cutting off the extreme low frequencies and the extreme high frequencies, and it's doing this around that cutoff frequency that we have set. So you hear the difference now. And if I raise it up, now we're going to be cutting off a band in the higher frequency range. And if I drop it down, you're going to hear only lower frequencies. Now one thing that works differently in the filter when you're talking about a band pass versus a high pass or a low pass filter is the resonance parameter. And the resonance parameter when using a band pass filter controls what's called sometimes called the Q or the width, and it controls the amount of frequency that's let through. So if you imagine when we have it down, we're letting a very narrow range of frequencies through. If you imagine that we have our frequency slider set to a frequency of 1,000 hertz, and we have the resonance very low, we're letting through a very small range of frequencies, maybe 100 hertz each way. I don't know the exact amounts, but as an example. And if we raise it up, now we're going to widen that range of frequencies that we're letting through. There's one other filter type here on this synth, and it's called a notch filter. And a notch filter, instead of letting only a certain frequency range through, cutting off the extreme highs and cutting off the extreme lows, it cuts out a range of frequencies in the middle somewhere, and it works very similar with the resonance parameter as the bandpass. So now what I'm going to go ahead and do here is just kind of sweep through the different frequency types so you can kind of hear or the different filter types, so you can kind of hear how it affects the filter differently. And I'm just going to keep the same note played as I change. So that kind of gives you an idea of how the filter works and how the different types of filter works. One more thing to mention here is in this synthesizer you see here that we have an LP12 and an LP24, and what that's talking about is it's talking about the slope of the frequency cutoff. And in this case it's referring, the 12 and the 24 are referring to the amount of decibels per octave that are being cut off. And generally the higher the number, the more slope, the more aggressive the frequency cut is. It's not super important that you understand the exact technicalities of what's going on here, but use your ears as a judge as you're building patches. Now the next part of the synth that I want to talk about here is the filter envelope. And the filter envelope works similar to the way the amp envelope works in conjunction with the volume of the synth over time, except this controls the cutoff frequency of the filter over time. The parameters, the attack, decay, sustain, and release work exactly the same way as they do for the amp envelope, but instead of affecting the volume, they're affecting that cutoff frequency on the filter. So I'm going to go ahead and put in kind of an extreme example here so that you can hear what's happening. And basically by raising the attack, what's going to happen is this cutoff frequency is over a period of time going to rise up, and you're going to hear that rise up, and then with the decay and the sustain it's going to fall down over time. So I'm just going to hold the note here so you can kind of hear how that's happening. Whoops, forgot to mention one other parameter here. The amount parameter. The amount parameter tells how much of the envelope is going to be applied. So you can see here that all these little parameters are important. So now you're going to hear the effect. Now you're going to hear it start dropping down again, and there we go, it dropped down. And the speed with which it's going to drop down and how far that frequency is going to drop down are controlled by the decay and the sustain. So if we want it to drop down not quite as fast, you heard it rise up real slow and then drop down back to the original value real quickly. And that's controlled by these two parameters. So here I'm going to raise the decay up, so it's kind of a slower drop down back to the original frequency here. Now it starts dropping back down, and you can kind of hear that. And how far that's going to drop down is going to be controlled by that sustain parameter. So if we don't want it to drop down quite as far, if we want that to raise up to a higher frequency and then drop down but not drop all the way back, we can raise that sustain value a little bit, and you'll hear how that applies. Now it's dropping down, but you hear it doesn't drop all the way. It keeps that cutoff frequency a little bit more open. The filter's letting a little bit more of the low pass through. And you hear that it applies very similarly depending on which type of filter you have. In this case, it's going to now drop to let lower frequencies through. and here with the bandpass. And now this amount knob that I forgot to apply earlier, this controls how much it's going to affect that cutoff knob. So if we have it real low, it's only going to apply a small change to the cutoff frequency. You hear it didn't quite raise to allow as many high frequencies through there. But if we turn it up higher and apply more of it, you're going to hear it's a much more drastic effect. So that's the filter and the filter envelope. The next section that I want to talk about here is the LFO. And what LFO stands for is low frequency oscillator. And what's essentially happening is we have an oscillator built into the synth that's not generating sound as our main oscillators do, but it's oscillating a parameter value. And what this allows us to do is to apply different things like pitch shifts over time, repeating pitch shifts that are going to vary, to change our filter frequency over time. A lot of different things you can do with an LFO. And there's going to be a few things that you're going to see on every synthesizer. It's going to first you're going to see something to the effect of a wave type, and this is similar to the waveforms in the oscillator that we saw before, except this applies to how the LFO is going to modify the sound over time. And you're also going to see a rate parameter, which controls the speed of the oscillator and how fast it's applying this varying effect, and then an amount which works similar to the filter envelope amount that controls how much that LFO is affecting the parameter that we're changing. And the last part you're going to see here is which parameter you're going to be changing. And every synth is going to have a different set of parameters that it's going to be able to affect, and what parameters are affected are going to be dependent on how the developers of that synthesizer design the synth. So let's go ahead here, and we're just going to apply a small amount of change to the oscillator frequency. You see here we have oscillator frequency set, and we're going to be applying it with a triangle waveform. So let's hear what that sounds like. And you hear it shifting the pitch kind of like siren. Now, if we change the wave type, you're going to hear that it applies that pitch change in a different manner. And you hear it raises it up and then drops it off real quick, unlike that smooth up and down motion of the triangle waveform. And this is the opposite sawtooth. And a square wave, which is going to be kind of an on-off sort of sound. And then this synthesizer has two other waveforms, two different random waveforms. One is a little bit smoother, another one is more of a square on and off type random. You hear how that second one is random, but it's just a little bit more smooth. So let's go back up to our triangle here, and let's change the rate so that you can hear how that affects the way the sound changes. Now let's go ahead and change the amount so you can hear how that sounds different. And here, by raising the amount, we're now getting a wider pitch shift variation than we were getting before. And you can change what parameter that's affecting by changing these little knobs right here, these little switches right here. Your synth is going to be a little bit different, of course. So if I wanted to change and have the LFO affect the filter frequency instead of the oscillator pitch, I can do that as well. So essentially what it's doing here is we're changing that cutoff frequency value. So it's letting sound through and then it's not. And of course if we change the amount, it's going to affect how much we're passing through to that filter frequency change. Now the last section that we're going to talk about in this tutorial here is called the mod envelope. And the mod envelope, again, it's a attack, decay, sustain, release type of envelope, and it works similarly. The difference between an LFO and a mod envelope is that instead of applying a oscillating sort of change to our parameter, we're going to be applying that envelope type of change that we had before. So we're going to go ahead and put in another pitch shift here, changing oscillator 1, and it's going to be a slow build and then a slow decay down to this sustain rate. So you're going to hear a pitch shift that's going to rise up, and then it's going to drop down, but it's not going to drop all the way down to where it was before, because where we have that sustain rate set right now. Oh, got to again apply some amount. There we go. And then you hear it dropping back down again. So that's essentially how the mod envelope works. And again, you have different parameters that you can apply the mod envelope to. We can apply it to volume instead of pitch shift, so you get a change in volume over time. Actually, this would be if we had multiple oscillators working at once. It's going to change that oscillator value. So it's changing that mix parameter, the volume between how much of this oscillator versus this oscillator is coming out of the synth. Or you can apply it to your filter frequencies and apply it here to filter 2. And of course these destinations of where the mod envelope is going to be affecting are going to be different on every synth, and your synth is going to be different than this one. But you just have a play around with those, and you'll get an idea for how you can change them. So that concludes part 2 in this tutorial. In the next part of this tutorial, I'm going to put together what we've discussed in part 1 and part 2 and show you how to make a few different types of patches. We're going to be making a bass patch, and we're going to be making kind of a didgeridoo sort of effect, and also a pad effect. And you'll kind of get an idea of how you can apply these parameters together to design different types of patches. So hope you enjoyed this tutorial, hope you learned something. If you did, please let your friends know about it, and stop by Mutant Audio again, and visit us at www.mutantaudio.net. Thanks for watching.